You know how they say betrayal cuts deep? Let me tell you something. Sometimes, it doesn't just cut. It shreds. My name's Jack Addington. I'm 49 years old, sharp as a tack, and I've lived long enough to learn a few things. Spent most of my life bouncing around, picking up scraps, working anything I could to survive. Worked security, worked the docks, hell, I even drove a cab for a while. Some people, they get comfortable in a job, but not me. I got into private investigations because it made sense. People lie, cheat, steal. That's all part of life. I figure I've got a knack for finding out what's hidden, and maybe a knack for finding the dirt in people's lives. It pays well, and I've never gotten soft. That's the key, you know? You stay sharp, you stay in control. Lately, though, I wasn't feeling all that sharp. Things were off. Not in the usual way, though. I'm talking about my marriage. Carmen, my wife. I thought I knew her. I thought we were solid. But when I started noticing the small stuff, the late nights, the missed calls, the random silence that started creeping in, I couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. I'd be sitting on the couch after work, flipping through the channels, and I'd catch her staring at her phone. She wasn't looking at it like she used to, checking messages, keeping track of her family. This was different. She'd hide it away real quick when I walked by. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. That was me, right? Just some guy with too much time on his hands, imagining things. But then it kept happening. You don't get to be in this line of work without developing a certain kind of awareness. You start noticing patterns, small, but telling. When you deal with the stuff I do, you have to pay attention to details. The way people walk, the way they talk, the way they look at you when they think you're not watching. A few weeks ago, I had a client who suspected his wife was cheating on him. He was the kind of guy who always assumed the worst, but when I watched her, I could tell she was hiding something. She didn't even know I was there. When I reported back, the guy almost broke down on the phone. He asked if I had proof. I didn't, not yet. But I could tell. It's that gut feeling. Same thing with Carmen. It was a Monday when I started putting the pieces together. She got home late from work, again. She smiled like usual, tried to act normal, but something was off. The smile didn't reach her eyes. She didn't look at me when she kissed me, and that was enough to tell me she wasn't even in the same room with me anymore. So I started looking closer. I never told her this, but I started watching her, trying to catch her in the act. At first, I didn't even know what the act was, but I had to know. I'd watch her from the kitchen, see her scribbling on a notepad, her phone face down beside her, or worse, on silent. She was more distant. And I get it. She was trying to manage her own stuff. Her career, her health, whatever. But it was the way she'd get snappy sometimes. The way she'd disappear into another room for hours on end. Always on the phone, whispering in low tones, like she didn't want me to hear. I figured it out a few days after. I ran a check on her phone records, just a basic trace of calls. I knew who she was talking to. I didn't need to see anything more. The numbers weren't ones I recognized, and one of them, a guy named Steve, kept popping up. I knew Steve. Kind of hard to avoid a guy when he's dating the woman you've been married to for 12 years. He was that charming type. The kind of guy who can talk his way out of any situation. Had this clean-cut look about him, always wearing those button-ups like he was trying to be somebody. But in reality, he wasn't. Just another smooth talker. I had the proof I needed. Didn't need anything more to get the picture. But I wasn't going to confront her just yet. I had a plan. And, hell, I wasn't the kind of guy to rush into something like that. I've always believed in making the right move, not just the quick one. That night, she came home, tired from a long day of meetings. I could see it in her eyes. She was hiding something, but she wasn't ready to admit it. She slipped off her coat, tossed it on the chair, and I didn't say a word. Just looked at her. I didn't have to say anything. She could feel it. You could always tell when someone knew. Anything interesting happened today? I asked, leaning back in my chair, trying to sound casual. She glanced at me, and for a second, I saw the guilt. Then it was gone. She just shook her head. Not really, she said, but it didn't hit me the same way anymore. It was like there was a wall between us. I didn't press her. Not yet. Instead, I waited. I had a few things to do first. The next morning, I set everything in motion. I called in a favor from a guy I used to work with at the security company, an old contact who ran a surveillance operation. He owed me one, so I figured I'd cash in. He put someone on her tail, shadowing her for a few days. Nothing fancy, just a couple of pictures, and maybe a recording or two. I wanted to know for sure. I wasn't about to make a move without the full picture. While that was happening, I kept my cool at home. Carmen had no clue. I made breakfast like usual, talked about the weather, nothing out of the ordinary. All the while, I was thinking about the next steps. I caught my wife, and now it was time to settle things. By the time the weekend rolled around, I had all the information I needed. My guy had followed her and Steve. They were meeting at a little park on the edge of town. Public enough, I guess, for them to think they were safe. A couple of innocent walks, some coffees, probably talking about all the stuff they'd been hiding. I didn't care about that. It wasn't the details that mattered. It was the fact that I had the proof. I called Steve's apartment building. Got the address. I wasn't going to wait any longer. Carmen was going to face the consequences. She was going to hear the truth from me, not some detective in the corner. And Steve? He was going to learn real quick that there were lines you don't cross. It's a funny thing. When you've been with someone long enough, you start to get this sense, this knowing. You know when they're lying. You know when they're keeping something from you. And if you're smart, if you've been paying attention, you'll catch it before they think they've gotten away with it. I wasn't about to give them that chance. I'd been around too long. The plan was simple. Catch them in the act, make sure I had everything lined up, and then hit them with it all. I wasn't about to make this any messier than it needed to be. So I waited. Saturday morning came, and I was sitting in my car across from Steve's building, watching, waiting. The sun was still low, barely scraping over the horizon. I could feel the tension in my bones. This was it. Carmen was still at home, but I had a feeling she'd be making her usual exit in the next hour or so. I lit a cigarette and took a drag, steadying myself. This wasn't about the rage. It wasn't about going off the deep end like some hot-headed fool. This was about control. About making sure that when I stepped into this, it wasn't to salvage some broken relationship. It was to end it. No drama, just the facts. As I sat there, I watched the traffic slowly pick up. The city wasn't too loud. Not yet. A couple of joggers passed by, and a few early birds were already setting up shop for the day. I didn't even flinch when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Kelly, my office assistant, always the quiet type. She had a way of checking in without saying much. "Hey, Jack. Everything all right?" she asked, her voice soft but sincere. "Yeah, Kelly. Just keeping an eye on things," I said, exhaling smoke into the early morning air. Nothing to worry about. I didn't need to say more. She knew better than to pry. Kelly had been around long enough to know when I was working a case, and when I was dealing with something personal. I could tell she wanted to ask more, but she didn't. I respected that. Around 9 a.m., I saw Carmen's car pull out of the driveway. She wasn't headed straight to the office, though. She made a left turn instead of her usual right, heading toward the outskirts of the city. It wasn't long before I saw Steve's car following her. I flicked my cigarette out the window, sat up straighter, and put the car in gear. I tailed them for a good 30 minutes, careful to stay out of their sight. They didn't know I was there. I was just another car in the morning rush. I watched as they drove further out of town, heading for a quieter, more secluded park. A little too quiet, if you ask me. They parked near a shaded corner by the baseball field, far from any nosy eyes. Carmen turned off the engine, and Steve got out of the car with that same cocky, self-assured look he always had. They walked toward the park's walking path, just two people pretending to be normal. I pulled into the lot a few cars down, keeping my distance. I wasn't interested in making a scene. I pulled out my camera from the passenger seat and snapped a few shots, careful to keep the lens hidden. I could see them in the distance, sitting on one of the benches by the trees, talking low. I had the feeling they weren't discussing the weather. For a moment, I let myself think about what was going on there. Was this really how it ended? With Carmen in the arms of some guy who didn't care about her the way I did? The thought hit me, but I pushed it down fast. No room for feelings now. This was business. Just another job that happened to involve the woman I'd spent more than a decade with. After about 30 minutes of back and forth chatting, and whatever else they were up to, I saw them stand up. Carmen looked around the park, like she didn't want anyone to see them. Steve gave her that stupid grin, like he thought he was untouchable. I snapped a few more photos as they walked back to the cars. They weren't making any effort to hide it now. The walk was casual, like nothing had changed. But it had. It had changed a lot. They parted ways at the cars, a quick goodbye, a kiss on the cheek from Steve, then they drove off in separate directions. I had everything I needed. Proof. Clear as day. It was time to make my move. Back home, I didn't say a word to Carmen when she came through the door. She was tired, dragging herself in with that same fake smile she'd been wearing for weeks. I didn't need to ask her where she'd been. The air between us had thickened. I could feel it. She wasn't stupid. She knew something was up. But she hadn't figured out what yet. I grabbed my jacket off the hook by the door and pulled it on, moving around her in the kitchen without saying a word. She glanced at me, but I was too focused. Didn't have time to go through the usual small talk. I wasn't pretending anymore. "You going somewhere?" she asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't want to stir the pot, not yet. But the crack in her voice betrayed her. "Yeah, got something I need to take care of," I said, grabbing my keys. I didn't tell her where I was headed, and I sure as hell wasn't going to explain it to her. Not yet. She could figure that out soon enough. She watched me, eyes narrowing, but I didn't stop moving. I was already out the door and into the car before she could ask more questions. I made the drive to Steve's apartment, a familiar place that always seemed to have that cheap, lived-in feel. The kind of place you don't want anyone to see you leave. It wasn't far, about 15 minutes from home. I parked down the street and waited. The sun was high in the sky now, and I knew this was going to be it. No going back. I had the evidence. I had the plan. I gave it a few minutes, then stepped out of the car, walking up to the front entrance of the building. The hallway was quiet, like it always was. The door to Steve's apartment was just down the hall, and I knew Carmen would be here soon, probably slipping in through the back, trying to keep things under wraps. But that wasn't happening today. Not with me on the job. When she arrived, I was already there, standing just outside the door. I didn't even look at her when she stepped out of the elevator. I wasn't going to make it easy for her. She stopped when she saw me, her face a mix of confusion and dread. It took her a moment to realize I knew. She didn't even ask what I was doing there. I could see it in her eyes. She knew she was caught. "Jack," she said, her voice weak, like she was still trying to figure out how to play it off. But I wasn't listening to the act anymore. "I think we need to talk," I said, and it wasn't a question. We didn't do the whole "why" or "how could you" routine. That wasn't my style. I wasn't here for that. I was here for one thing only, the truth. She reached into her purse with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before, fingers closing around a set of keys. Without hesitation, she unlocked the door and stepped inside like she belonged there. Like this was her home. No second thoughts, no fumbling. Just muscle memory. I stepped into the apartment and shut the door behind me. The smell of stale coffee hit me right away, mixed with the faint scent of cheap cologne. It was too familiar, too cozy. Steve's place. Nothing about it felt like home, but it was where my wife had been slipping away to. It wasn't the first time I'd been here in my mind, but now I was standing in it. And I wasn't leaving until I had what I came for. Carmen stood in the doorway, hands hanging loosely by her sides. She looked worn out, like she hadn't slept well in days. Her hair was messy, like she'd been running her hands through it. Not that it mattered. She was looking for a way out of this, but there was no escape. She tried to make eye contact, but I wouldn't let her. I wasn't interested in her excuses right now. "Jack, you." "No, Carmen," I cut her off, my voice steady but firm. "You don't get to say anything just yet. Not until I'm done." I watched her swallow, her eyes darting to the floor, to the walls, anywhere but at me. The silence between us wasn't filled with words, it was filled with the weight of everything unsaid. She knew what was coming. She just didn't know how bad it was going to get. I wasn't going to let her wriggle out of it. She could deny it to herself, but I wasn't letting her do it to me. "You've been with him, haven't you?" I asked, looking her dead in the eye. I wasn't angry, not yet, but I was getting there. I wanted her to know that I saw through the lies. I didn't need the details. I didn't need to know how long. All I needed was the truth. She didn't answer right away. I could see her wrestling with it, whether to tell me the truth or try to make something up. I wasn't waiting for her to work it out. "Answer me," I pressed. "Was it him? Or were you with him before?" The room felt smaller, like the air was getting thick. She finally nodded, a small, reluctant movement, but it was enough. There was nothing left to hide. "Yeah," she said quietly, voice almost a whisper. "It's been going on for months. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to... How to what?" I cut in, taking a step closer. "How to end it, but keep your little comfort. You didn't think I'd find out?" My voice wasn't shaking. It was cold. I wasn't sure if I was angry or just numb. Maybe both. She opened her mouth, probably to try and explain herself, but I wasn't having it. "Let me guess," I said, pacing in the small living room. "You didn't want to hurt me. You didn't want to upset our life. But here we are. You've done it already." Carmen's shoulders slumped. I could see the guilt, But she wasn't crying. Not yet. There was no drama here, no tears or begging. She wasn't going to turn this into a sob story, and I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. I wasn't going to pity her. Not now. Not after all this. I don't even care about the details anymore, I said, voice low. I don't care about the how or the why. It's over. I looked at her, not with anger, but with finality. I had everything I needed. I didn't need to chase answers I already had. She flinched, and that was enough. There was nothing left to say. The truth hung between us, heavy and undeniable. She was still standing there, but it didn't matter. This was the end of the line. Where is he? I asked, my tone flat. I wasn't interested in small talk. Where is Steve? You think I don't know where to find him? Carmen didn't even flinch at the mention of his name. She didn't try to defend him, didn't make excuses for him. She just let out a slow breath. I don't know. He's probably out. You want to talk to him? Her words were empty, like she didn't care anymore. She'd already made her choice. I looked her over for a moment, wondering if there was any point in continuing this conversation. Then I shook my head. No, I don't need to talk to him. I've got everything I need. I wasn't going to waste my time on Steve. Carmen was the one I needed to finish with. I turned away from her and walked toward the door. It wasn't anger or disappointment that fueled me anymore. It was just the finality of it all. The truth was out, and it couldn't be put back in the bottle. She didn't stop me when I turned the handle, didn't even try to say anything else. Before I stepped out, I looked back at her. You need to figure out what you're going to do, Carmen. I'm done. I'll take care of everything. She didn't answer, didn't make a sound. I closed the door behind me, the soft click of it echoing in my head. I didn't even feel the weight of the decision anymore. I wasn't broken by it. I wasn't angry. I just felt done. I stepped back into the hallway and walked down the stairs to the street, where I spotted Steve's car parked down the block. He hadn't come out yet, probably still too busy congratulating himself for whatever pathetic little game he thought he was playing. But I wasn't wasting any more time on him. Carmen had already made her bed. She could deal with the consequences of her choices. I pulled out my phone and called Kelly. Hey, Jack, she answered, sounding unsure. Everything okay? Yeah, I said, the words coming out easy. I've got everything I need. It's done. She didn't ask for details, and that was fine by me. She knew me well enough to know when I was done. I hung up and started walking, letting the cool morning air hit my face. I didn't need to stick around for any more drama. I'd get to the fallout later. Right now, I just needed to get away. The rest of it could wait. I didn't head straight home. There was something about the idea of sitting in that house, staring at the same walls where everything had fallen apart, that made my skin crawl. Instead, I took a drive. The streets were empty, but the weight of everything kept pressing down on me. I wasn't mad anymore. I was past that. The decisions had already been made, and I was just cleaning up the mess. I drove until I found myself outside of Steve's apartment building again, parked a few blocks away, just waiting for him to show up. I sat in the car for a while, thinking. I didn't need to go in there, didn't need to have a big confrontation with the guy. But I wasn't going to let him just slip away from this either. There had to be some accountability. Carmen might have made her choice, but Steve was going to learn real quick that I wasn't just some guy who'd roll over and take it. He was going to feel the consequences, and he wasn't going to see it coming. It didn't take long before I saw him walking down the street, hands shoved in his pockets like he had no care in the world. He didn't even notice me parked in the car. I waited a moment longer, just to make sure he was alone, then I got out and started walking toward him. Steve, I called out. He froze mid-step, his head snapping around when he saw me. His face shifted, but not in a way that showed fear, more like surprise, like I was the last person he expected to show up. But I wasn't here to ask questions. I wasn't here to hear his bullshit. What the hell is this about, Jack? He tried to put on this tough guy act, but it was clear he didn't know what to expect. You got a problem with me? I got a problem with you screwing around with my wife, I said, keeping my voice even. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an accusation. It was just the plain truth. You think you can just slip in, play the hero while I'm out working, and I won't notice? His jaw clenched, but he didn't back off. Look, man, I didn't mean to. Don't make this about your intentions, Steve. It's about what happened. You knew she was married. You knew she was mine. And you didn't give a damn. He was silent for a second, and for a moment, I thought he might try to talk his way out of it. But then he took a deep breath, probably trying to steady himself. You don't get it, Jack. He paused, looking over my shoulder, like he was looking for an escape route. It wasn't just some fling. We. Save it, I cut him off. You don't need to explain yourself. You need to hear the truth. I took a step closer to him, keeping my voice low but firm. I'm not angry anymore, Steve. I don't need to be. But you're going to pay for this. I'm not going to drag it out. No shouting, no big scenes. I'll let people know what you did. You won't walk away from this like it's nothing. I could see his face shift. A little twitch at the corner of his mouth, his eyes darting between me and the ground. The confidence was starting to crack. You think that's going to do something? He asked, trying to sound tough. But there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice now. Yeah, I do, I said. I'm going to make sure everyone knows the kind of guy you really are. This isn't just about Carmen. This is about you thinking you can play with people's lives and not face the consequences. You're not untouchable, Steve. You'll get what's coming to you. His eyes narrowed, but I could see the shift in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed like he wasn't sure what to do next. He had this brief moment where he thought he might take a swing at me, but I wasn't some kid he could push around. He sized me up for a second, probably debating if it was worth the trouble to try. I didn't flinch. I don't have time for this, he muttered, his hands still in his pockets, like he was trying to avoid the confrontation, trying to talk his way out of it. Then leave, I said, stepping aside, watching him. But know this. Everything you thought you had is about to be taken away. You won't see it coming. You'll be cut off before you even realize what hit you. He hesitated, but then just turned and walked away, hands still jammed in his pockets, trying to act like he wasn't rattled. I let him go. That was it. I wasn't going to chase him down, wasn't going to get in a fight. What mattered now is what came next. I pulled out my phone and made a few calls. I wasn't looking to destroy him, but I wasn't about to let him go unscathed either. I put a few key people in the right place, made sure word spread about what had been going on. It didn't take long. Steve wasn't as untouchable as he thought he was. Not in a small town like this. He'd see his social circle shrink before he even realized what had happened. I didn't need to be involved after that. The consequences would do the work for me. I headed back to my car and drove home. Carmen was still there, and this time, there were no games. I wasn't going to pretend like things were normal. She was waiting for me when I stepped inside, but I didn't look at her at first. I went straight to the kitchen and grabbed a drink. She stood in the doorway, looking at me, probably expecting some sort of emotional outburst, some kind of confrontation. I didn't give it to her. I wasn't there for that. You don't have to say anything, I said, not looking at her. It's over. I'm done. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, probably trying to make sense of it. I didn't care about her explanation. I'd had enough. I turned and looked at her. You can stay here if you want, but know this. I'm not here to fix this. I'm not here to play that game anymore. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair. You make your choices, but don't expect me to be a part of them anymore. She opened her mouth to say something, but I wasn't having it. I turned and walked out the door, the sound of it closing behind me louder than any of her words ever could be. I didn't look back. This chapter of my life was done. I had a plan, and now it was time to follow through. The next few weeks were a blur. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't exactly settled either. I'd put everything in motion, made sure Carmen and Steve both understood the weight of their decisions. The word spread, as I knew it would. People started distancing themselves from them, and they didn't even realize why at first. But I wasn't here to play the long game, not with them. I had my own life to rebuild. I didn't feel like sticking around. I didn't want to see Carmen, didn't want to hear her apologies. There was nothing to fix. So, I packed up what I needed and started making calls. It didn't take long before I found a place. A small vineyard in Tuscany, an old property I'd been eyeing for years but never thought I'd have the guts to buy. I wasn't about to waste time looking back. The past was dead, and I was moving forward. The paperwork was signed, and the next thing I knew, I was flying across the world. It was a strange feeling, leaving everything behind. The city, the people who knew me, and the ghost of a life I'd built with Carmen. But none of it mattered now. The only thing that mattered was getting out of the chaos, away from the memories. I needed something new, something that didn't come with baggage. The first few days in Italy were a haze. The landscape was beautiful, rolling hills, vineyards as far as the eye could see. It felt like a different life, one that I could actually build for myself. The place I'd bought was small, but it had potential. The house needed work, but nothing I couldn't handle. The vineyard itself was in decent shape, but it had been neglected for a while. I knew I had my work cut out for me, but it was the kind of work I could lose myself in. I spent the first week mostly alone, getting a feel for the land, figuring out what needed fixing, and making sure I knew where I stood with the local suppliers. I wasn't looking for a fresh start because I was broken. I was looking for it because I wanted control over my own life again. This wasn't about escaping the past. This was about building something new. Then, a few weeks in, I ran into Bethany. She was the daughter of one of the local farmers, a woman in her mid-30s, with a calm demeanor and a smile that didn't feel forced. She had an easy way about her, a sense of peace that I wasn't used to. The first time we met, I was picking up supplies from the market when she approached me. "You're the one who bought the place up the hill," she said. "I've seen you around." I gave a short nod. "That's me, Jack Addington. Been here a little over a month now." She smiled a little. "I'm Bethany. I help my father with the farm down the road. I heard you're fixing up the vineyard." "Trying to, anyway," I said with a half smile, rubbing the back of my neck. "A lot of work ahead of me." "You'll get it done," she said with an easy confidence. "I've seen a lot of people try to do this kind of thing. Most of them give up after the first season. But you seem like you know what you're doing." I didn't say much in return. I was used to people saying that kind of thing out of politeness, but Bethany didn't feel like she was just being nice. There was something different about the way she looked at things, something grounded. We ran into each other a few more times over the next couple of weeks, usually at the market or around town. Each time, she'd offer advice about the land, about the local wine, about anything that might help me make this place work. It was never too much, just little tidbits, like she wasn't trying to sell me anything, just trying to be helpful. She was easy to talk to, but not in the way that made you want to unload all your problems. There was a quiet wisdom about her that I found intriguing. I hadn't expected to find someone like her out here, someone who didn't want anything, who wasn't trying to get something from me. I spent a lot of time on the vineyard, working the fields, tending to the plants, doing everything I could to make the place feel like it was mine. It was grueling work, but it was rewarding, and there was no room for distractions. But after a while, Bethany and I started talking more. It was nothing serious at first. I wasn't looking for anything other than a peaceful life. But she was different from everyone I'd met before. One afternoon, after a long day of work, I stopped by her family's farm on my way back to the house. She was outside, gathering some of the vegetables they'd grown, looking like she hadn't even broken a sweat. She smiled when she saw me, but didn't say much. We stood there for a minute, just watching the fields, the sun starting to dip low. "I've been thinking about what you said." I finally broke the silence, wiping the sweat from my brow. "About making the vineyard work. I think I'm starting to get the hang of it." She nodded, but didn't say anything for a moment. "It's a lot of work," she said finally. "But if you stick with it, you'll see results. It's a slow process. You can't rush something like this." "I'm not the rushing type," I said. "I've got time. And I've learned a lot of lessons the hard way." She didn't ask what lessons, but there was something in the way she looked at me that told me she understood. The weeks stretched into months, and the vineyard began to take shape in ways I hadn't expected. The work was tough, but there was something about it that felt right. Something about getting my hands dirty again, about putting in the long hours, about doing something for myself. The vineyard wasn't just a project. It was mine, my own piece of the world. And with every vine I pruned, every row of grapes I tended to, it felt like I was taking back control, piece by piece. Bethany and I had started spending more time together, but it was never anything serious. We talk about the land, about the weather, about the things that made this place feel like home. She didn't ask about my past, and I didn't push her about hers. We were both content in the silence between us, in the easy rhythm of the work, of the land. Every now and then, I'd catch her smile when I made some offhand comment about how the vines were growing, or how the fermentation was going. I didn't need much more than that. One evening, after a long day of work, I walked into town to pick up some supplies. The small town felt different now. People had started to recognize me, and I could see them nodding as I passed. The rumors had died down, the stories about the new guy who had come to buy the vineyard. They didn't talk about it anymore. They just accepted me as part of the landscape now, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't the outsider. When I walked into the market, I found Bethany behind the counter. She wasn't surprised to see me. She never was. She always seemed to know when I'd show up. The shop smelled of fresh bread and herbs, and for a second, I could almost forget about the past. The noise of the city, the chaos, it all felt like a distant memory. "You look like you've been working hard," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Didn't think I'd see you for another couple of days. Everything good at the vineyard?" I nodded. "It's going. Been a long week, but it's all coming together. I shifted on my feet, looking around at the jars of honey and the stacks of fresh produce. Figured I'd swing by for some of your dad's wine. Need something for tonight. She smiled, a small, quiet thing. My dad's wine isn't exactly the kind of thing you drink every day, but I can get you a bottle if you want. I'll even give you a discount. I raised an eyebrow at that. Discount? Huh? Guess that's your way of getting me to spend more money. She chuckled lightly, shaking her head. I'm just trying to keep you coming back. I wasn't sure why she always seemed so calm around me, why she could always make a joke or a comment that didn't feel forced. I wasn't used to it, but it was easy to appreciate. I'm still learning the ropes, I said, tapping my fingers on the counter. I'm getting used to the land, but there's a lot I don't know. I'm not exactly the vintner type. Not yet. Anyway, you'll get there, she said. Her eyes flicked toward the shelves behind me, then back to my face. It takes time. Nothing worth doing happens overnight. I watched her as she reached for a bottle of wine, twisting the cap off before handing it to me. Thanks, I said, taking the bottle from her. There was something in the way she moved, steady, unhurried, that made me feel like I wasn't rushing through my life anymore. Like I had time. Maybe for the first time in a while, I actually believed it. Don't thank me yet, she said, her voice quieter this time. You haven't even tasted it. I gave her a small smile. I'll make sure to let you know what I think of it. As I paid for the bottle and walked out of the store, I realized something that hadn't hit me until now, something that felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I wasn't just getting through the days anymore. I was living them. And for once, it wasn't about survival. It was about living in a place that felt right. A place that had room for me, for my future. Later that night, I sat out on the porch of the house I'd made into my own, a glass of Bethany's father's wine in hand. It was peaceful. There was no drama. No loud voices or chaos. I didn't need anything else. I thought about what had happened, about Carmen, about Steve, and realized I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to settle scores. I'd let it all go. All that mattered was what I was building here, what I was creating for myself. The life I was making in this place was all that I had. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. As I finished the last of my wine, I set the glass down and leaned back in the chair, looking out over the land. The work would never be done, but that was okay. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't looking for an easy way out. I was finally standing still. And it felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Months passed, and the vineyard flourished in a way I hadn't expected. The vines grew stronger, the soil more fertile, and my sense of peace grew with it. The work had its long days, but I didn't mind. I was doing something that mattered now, something I had control over. One evening, Bethany came by the vineyard after work, just to check on things. We stood there for a moment, looking out at the rows of vines that were already bearing fruit. I could see the satisfaction on her face as she looked over the land. You've done a good job here, she said, breaking the silence. This place, it's not the same as when you first came. Yeah, I said, watching the land. It's more than just work now. It's mine, and I'm not planning on giving it up. She glanced at me, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. No reason to. You've earned it. There was no need to say anything more. We both knew it. The land, the work, the time, it had all come together in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the vineyard I had found here. I had found peace. A kind of quiet strength that had been missing from my life for so long. I thought about the past sometimes, but it was different now. It didn't haunt me anymore. Carmen and Steve were no longer a part of my story. Their names faded into the background of my life, nothing more than echoes. I didn't need to keep track of them. They'd made their choices, and I'd made mine. They were stuck with the mess they'd made. I wasn't. I had everything I needed now. By the time the next harvest came around, the vineyard was in full swing. The grapes were ripe, and the town had started to take notice. People were talking about the guy who'd turned the place around, the one who knew what he was doing. Bethany was still around, still a steady presence in my life. She didn't push me, didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. And I didn't need to tell her everything. I was content with what we had. It wasn't about rushing anything. It was about enjoying the moment and building something worth keeping. When the harvest ended, I took a moment to reflect on what I had done. The vineyard, the town, everything, it was a long way from the chaos I'd left behind. The anger, the hurt, the mess of it all, it was gone. In its place was something stronger. Something I could stand on. I went to the local pub one night after everything had settled down, just to have a drink and check in with the town. The bartender, a guy named Marco, nodded when I walked in. Good harvest? he asked, pouring me a drink. Better than expected, I said, tipping my glass. Made it through. You've got a good thing going here, he said, looking over his shoulder at the quiet pub. People are starting to talk about you. In a good way. I didn't need anything more than that. It was enough. I wasn't looking for the town's approval, but it felt good knowing I wasn't the topic of gossip anymore. People weren't talking behind my back. They were starting to respect what I'd done. The vineyard, the town, everything, it was mine. And I was done letting anything or anyone stand in my way. As I walked back to the vineyard, the ground under my feet felt steady. I wasn't looking for redemption. I had found it. And I wasn't going to waste it. I had control now. And that was more than enough. If you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe to the channel.